know if it's good news or interesting news. So the Supreme Court's had a lot of problems. Nobody trusts them. They've been making shit up. I mean, they've been breaking precedent. Recently, with the Trump versus the United States, they ruled in Trump's favor, basically giving him immunity as president on a number of fields. But it's interesting because in the Constitution, it specifically states the president a former president can be indicted and tried for criminal acts. And they're basically throwing that out, and they've basically thrown out that part of the Constitution by rendering the Constitution unconstitutional in that decision. So it's weird, and it breaks all the previous precedent on this issue of presidential powers, because had that ruling been in place when Nixon was president, Nixon wouldn't have stepped down, and he wouldn't have had to have been pardoned by his successor. So, I mean, we've changed things quite a bit here, so it's basically given the president carte blanche. On top of that fact, they've reversed Roe v. Wade when it wasn't even discussed in the Dodd decision. They just tacked it on for no reason. So it's become pretty bad. On top of the fact, we know that Roberts, for one, and Clarence Thomas and Alito, especially Terrence Thomas and Alito, have all taken bribes. They all have ties to these right-wing groups like the Heritage Foundation, which is funding Project 2025, which is the thought process there, and quite a bit of money, especially Clarence Thomas. But Clarence Thomas's wife is literally a lobbyist for these right-wing Christian nationalist groups. And Alito's wife, we know, is a right-wing nationalist. So, kind of interesting stuff. What's going to happen with the Supreme Court? They have a lot of power. They've been really screwing with the government. They've changed centuries of precedent just in the last few years. And it's been pretty devastating. But some action's being taken. Ocasio-Cortez and a bunch of other progressives have decided to go ahead and try to impeach him. And we're going to talk about that real quick.
Democratic Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez has filed articles of impeachment against Supreme Court Justices Clarence Thomas and Samuel Alito. It follows two Democratic senators asking the Justice Department to investigate Thomas. They want a special counsel to look into whether Thomas violated federal ethics and tax laws. The senators say that he didn't disclose more than $267,000 of a loan allegedly forgiven in 2008 as income. Senator Sheldon Whitehouse of Rhode Island and Senator Ron Wyden of Oregon say there's evidence that Thomas willfully broke laws. The complaint also mentions free travel and gifts, largely unreported on Thomas's financial disclosure forms. Those were first reported by Scripps News partner ProPublica.
So, two things happened here. One, AOC filed articles of impeachment on Thomas and Alito for taking some of these bribes and other stuff. We'll get into that in a second. The other was Ron Wyden and I think it was Whitehouse, where senators actually pressured the DOJ, and they moved forward to the DOJ to investigate Thomas. I don't know about Alito, but Thomas for sure on criminal activity, because if Thomas is taking this money and not claiming it, Thomas is committing tax evasion. So it's tax fraud. I mean, if you sit there going, well, yeah, but he's taking bribes, and isn't that an ethics violation, all that? Actually, it isn't. There is no ethical rules on the Supreme Court, because they get to make their own rules, and there isn't any. And that's part of why this impeachment process is going through. So here's Axios with AOC, and we'll cover what her strategy is here, what the progressive strategy is here. So AOC unveils articles of impeachment against Justices Thomas and Alito. Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and a group of House Progressive on Wednesday introduced articles of impeachment against conservative Supreme Court Justices Thomas and Alito, blah, blah, blah. Why it matters. It's a long-shot element of a broader legislative push by House Democrats to rein in the court after a spate of decisions in June that incensed liberals. So this is what that means. By impeaching them, right now, the Republicans control the House. There's no way they're going to get the votes to impeach. It's highly unlikely. But it does a couple things real quickly. By doing that, it means they can start investigating them, which puts pressure that if they find something more, something dirty, on top of that fact, the Senate's putting pressure on them, right, to investigate with the DOJ. If something comes up, it's going to look really bad. And it's going to put a lot of pressure on John Roberts to maybe start reining him in and putting down some ethical rulings. Because right now, there is rules of ethics for federal judges. The Supreme Court just happens to be exempt, which is kind of bullshit. And Roberts has defended that. that they should be exempt. Well, they're trying to pressure him to do something. If he does or doesn't, we'll see. But it's something to try and put some pressure and leverage on them to do that. On the other side of the coin, it's also kind of a threat, because if the Democrats win in November and they take the House, or they'd probably take the House, but they have to also keep the Senate, which is kind of up for grabs. And Biden's president. Well, in that case, Biden would be president. Now they have the votes to impeach and do a full investigation and a full hearing, which means they'll drag all the questionable Supreme Court justices through the mud on national television, just like they did Trump's impeachment. So Roberts has to start sweating a little bit about this, about what's he going to do. The other thing it does is by forcing the impeachment vote and getting in there, a lot of, like in New York especially, and some of the like California stuff, you get some of these sort of like swing districts which have Republican representatives, House representatives. Well, what happens is they're going to be forced to vote not to impeach after all this obvious bribery and Thomas taking all, just like blatantly, which should be criminal shit, right? And bias and all that. And so they're going to start running ads against those people coming up into the election. Hey, Thomas did all this, he's taking all this money, blah, blah, blah. And this guy voted not to impeach him. So it puts pressure on Republicans who are running in more swing districts. So it gives them more leverage going into the election to try and knock some of those people out. So all in all, it's not a bad strategy. It's better than nothing, but it's a great idea to move forward. What's the worst that can happen, right? So the resolutions. I just want to finish this up. Driving the news. The resolutions accuse Thomas and Alito of refusing to recuse from cases in which they had personal bias or prejudice concerning a party. That's a fact. As well as failure to disclose incomes, gifts, and other financial information. Also factual. The articles targeting Thomas include a third charge, refusal to recuse from matters involving his spouse, because his wife was involved in January 6th. And he still ruled on the immunity case, which dealt with January 6th. The resolutions point to lavish gifts both justices received from benefactors reportedly involved, interconnected to cases before the Supreme Court. They were directly involved with the cases and sponsored some of them. The measures also point to the involvement of Ginny Thomas, Clarence Thomas's wife, in efforts to overturn the 2020 election, and reports of Stop the Steal symbols at Alito's property to argue that the recusal from January 6th related cases was warranted as well. So this is not going to go anywhere, because even if they get it through the House and they get an impeachment, which they're not going to get, it's got to go to the Senate. You got to get a 2/3 vote from the Senate to impeach him, which isn't going to happen. So it seems like it's stupid, except for it puts a lot of pressure on John Roberts, and it puts a big spotlight on the Supreme Court, right? Because the Supreme Court's trying to legislate when the judicial branch, they're not supposed to be doing that. And so the legislature to attack them and put a check on them is a good thing. And to put pressure on them is a good thing. That's what they should be doing as the legislator. So, hats off to the progressives for actually doing their job here. So that'll put pressure on them. On top of that, it'll put pressure on their Republican opponents and delicate seats in the House that they desperately need. It'll put pressure on those guys because they can say, look, they're just as corrupt because they voted not to impeach these guys that are clearly taking bribes. So, all in all, it's a good strategy for the Democrats. They can only gain from this. They can't really lose. So.